Babe, that's deep in there. Give them a cleavage? People want cleavage. Showcase it.
Sells good.
Sells. That's me.
That's a good song.
Kirk's ex is what? Taking over for Charlie Kirk? I'm sorry, are we supposed to pretend that this is normal? Because this is very odd.
That man, he was present at that meeting.
It wasn't leaked online, it wasn't dropped by the media, and it wasn't supposed to come out at all. When Candace Owens allegedly confronted Erika Kirk over what insiders called a private tape, the internet didn't just react, it exploded. Screenshots flew. Hashtags trended. Fans claimed the power dynamic shifted overnight. According to viral speculation, this wasn't exposure for attention. It was leverage. A forgotten past, an old relationship, and footage that contradicted everything the public thought they knew. As rumours spread, users tagged at Erika Kirk, demanding answers, while others accused Candace Owens of playing a dangerous game. What made this moment feel disturbing wasn't the tape itself. It was the timing. Right as loyalty was being questioned, right as old connections resurfaced. Online, when secrets meet influence, the story never stays quiet. And once the word blackmail enters the conversation, nothing feels accidental anymore. The story did not begin with a leak. It began with pressure. When online commentators claimed that Candace Owens possessed damaging material involving Erika Kirk, the narrative shifted instantly from curiosity to control. The word blackmail appeared everywhere, not because it was proven, but because it felt plausible. In digital culture, plausibility is often enough to ignite belief. The alleged tape itself mattered less than the idea that it existed. Viewers were primed to assume that a private recording could contradict a carefully maintained public image. That assumption fueled engagement before verification could even be considered. Screenshots spread, captions escalated, and hashtags framed the moment as a power struggle rather than a rumor. At the center of the speculation sat Erika Kirk, portrayed as suddenly vulnerable, not accused through evidence, but positioned through implication. The framing suggested that past intimacy with an ex had never fully stayed in the past. Whether that was true was irrelevant to the algorithm. What mattered was tension. The alleged leverage attributed to Candace Owens amplified the drama. Authority plus secrecy creates fear. Fear drives clicks. Posts claimed confrontation, pressure, and exposure without ever presenting proof. Each repost strengthened familiarity, and familiarity quickly masqueraded as truth. Tagging behavior intensified. Users tagged at Erika Kirk demanding responses to claims she had not acknowledged. Others tagged commentary pages to widen reach. The tagging transformed speculation into confrontation, creating the sense that silence required interpretation. The algorithm rewarded the most extreme framing. Content implying blackmail traveled further than content urging caution. Words like cheating, naughty tape, and exposed outperformed neutral language. The system elevated emotional certainty over factual uncertainty. Commentary pages leaned into the power narrative. Titles emphasized dominance and betrayal. Thumbnails suggested confrontation without documentation. The reaction itself became the headline. Presentation implied confirmation without providing it. As engagement grew, the story detached from its origin. Few viewers could identify where the claim started. Many could describe how it felt. Feeling replaced fact. Emotion replaced verification. Or the alleged ex became symbolic. Not a person, but a representation of unfinished history. Symbolism allowed viewers to fill gaps with imagination. Imagination fueled certainty. Silence again became part of the narrative. Supporters of Candace Owens interpreted silence as guilt. Defenders of Erika Kirk interpreted silence as restraint. Bias determined meaning. No evidence was required. Language escalated steadily. Blackmail hardened from speculation into assumption. Cheating shifted from question to label. These shifts happened through repetition, not proof. By the end of this phase, the story felt established. No documents had surfaced. No confirmations appeared. Yet belief had formed. The narrative now moved on momentum alone. This was not exposure, it was positioning. And positioning is powerful online because it frames perception before facts arrive. Once the idea of leverage enters a story, neutrality disappears. Viewers pick sides. Engagement spikes. Nuance dies. The stage was set. The internet waited for escalation that might never come, convinced that something disturbing had already been uncovered. As days passed, repetition hardened belief further. Users referenced earlier posts instead of original material. Each reference functioned as confirmation. The cycle fed itself quietly but efficiently. New viewers encountered conclusions before context, inheriting assumptions without question. The framing of blackmail introduced moral urgency. Blackmail implies coercion. Coercion implies wrongdoing. Wrongdoing invites judgment. This chain progressed without evidence because each step felt emotionally logical. Logic replaced verification. Hashtags evolved to match the escalation. Tags implying control and betrayal replaced earlier curiosity. These tags instructed audiences how to feel. Feeling directed attention more effectively than information ever could. The power imbalance narrative dominated discussion. Candace Owens was framed as holding leverage. Erika Kirk was framed as cornered. Stories of power resonate because they simplify complexity into winners and losers. Comment sections reflected polarization. Some demanded accountability, others warned against speculation. Both sides amplified reach. Conflict sustained visibility better than agreement. The absence of new information did not slow momentum. It intensified it. Absence was interpreted as build-up. A build-up keeps audiences engaged even when substance is missing. Creators speculated cautiously while guiding interpretation. Questions were framed to suggest answers. This approach preserved deniability while maintaining narrative direction. The idea of cheating functioned symbolically. It represented betrayal not just of a partner, but of an image. Image betrayal is particularly potent online. It feels personal to audiences who invested trust. As belief solidified, the story began influencing unrelated content. Any appearance by Erika Kirk was filtered through suspicion. Neutral actions felt strategic. Ordinary silence felt loaded. The algorithm reinforced this lens by resurfacing related content. Viewers encountered repeated affirmations of the same interpretation. Repetition strengthened memory. Memory strengthened belief. By now, the narrative no longer required updates. It existed as background knowledge. Background knowledge shapes interpretation invisibly. This phase revealed how easily power narratives override skepticism. Once blackmail is implied, audiences assume hidden evidence exists. Hidden evidence cannot be disproven. It thrives on absence. The story's persistence demonstrated a familiar pattern. Extreme framing trends. Caution fades. Assumption settles. The cycle repeats. What mattered most was not what happened, but how it was framed. Framing turned speculation into certainty without crossing the line of proof. The internet moved forward carrying this belief quietly. The stage was prepared for further escalation, even if none ever arrived. This moment illustrated the danger of influence colliding with rumor. When authority hints at secrets, audiences assume truth. When platforms reward certainty, doubt disappears entirely. The narrative did not need confirmation to feel real. It only needed alignment between fear, curiosity, and power. Once those elements aligned, the story stopped belonging to evidence. It belonged to momentum, interpretation, and expectation. That expectation now drives the next phase where pressure intensifies, audiences demand answers. Silence feels louder and speculation sharpens. Every pause is interpreted, every glance analyzed, every move questioned. the cycle accelerates because belief already exists beneath attention, waiting quietly to justify escalation when the moment arrives. And when it does, momentum will not ask permission first, because the narrative already feels decided to millions watching online right now everywhere today. Once the idea of leverage entered the narrative, everything changed. The internet stopped asking what existed and started asking who controlled what. This shift was subtle, but powerful. Allegations no longer needed proof because the story was no longer about facts. It was about power, influence, and silence. Online commentators framed Candace Owens as someone who didn't need to release anything to win. The implication alone was enough. Viewers believed that if damaging material truly existed, the smartest move would be not to show it at all. That logic felt convincing, even though it rested entirely on assumption. As this framing spread, the alleged tape became almost irrelevant. People stopped speculating about its contents and focused instead on its function. The narrative suggested it wasn't meant to be seen. It was meant to be feared. Fear travels faster than footage. Hashtags evolved again. Early tags about exposure were replaced by tags about control and pressure. These tags framed the situation as a standoff, a battle of influence where one side supposedly held an advantage. Viewers were drawn to the drama of imbalance. Her tagging behaviour intensified. Mentions of Erika Kirk appeared beneath posts asserting that silence was strategic. The implication was clear. If nothing were wrong, why not respond? This framing ignored a critical reality. Responding to speculative claims often magnifies them. But nuance does not trend. The algorithm rewarded certainty. Posts claiming the situation was obvious travelled further than posts urging restraint. Confidence outperformed caution. The system amplified voices that sounded sure, regardless of accuracy. Commentary pages leaned into the leverage narrative. Titles emphasized domination and exposure without release. Thumbnails suggested confrontation behind closed doors. The idea that something unseen was more powerful than something shown became central. As engagement grew, the narrative detached further from its origin. Very few viewers could identify where the blackmail claim began. Many could describe how it made them feel. Feeling replaced memory. Memory replaced fact. The alleged cheating claim hardened quietly. It moved from rumour to implication to assumption without ever being verified. The claim functioned symbolically, representing betrayal of trust rather than a specific act. Symbolic betrayal is difficult to disprove. Fan communities polarised more sharply. Some argued that power plays were inevitable in high-profile circles. Others warned that speculation was spiralling. Both sides contributed to reach. Disagreement kept the story alive. Language escalated subtly. Words like cornered, exposed, and controlled appeared more frequently. These words shaped perception. They suggested inevitability. Inevitability reduces skepticism. Silence continued to fuel interpretation. Supporters of Candace Owens viewed silence as validation. Defenders of Erika Kirk viewed silence as self-preservation. The same absence produced opposite meanings depending on belief. Archived moments were re-examined through this new lens. Neutral interactions were reframed as tense. Ordinary gestures were read as signals. The past was rewritten to support the present narrative. The algorithm reinforced this reinterpretation by resurfacing related content. Viewers encountered the same framing repeatedly. Repetition strengthened belief. Belief reduced doubt. At this stage, the story no longer needed escalation to persist. It existed as background tension. Background tension shapes interpretation without demanding attention. The power narrative proved especially sticky because it required no evidence. Leverage thrives on secrecy. Secrecy cannot be disproven. Any denial can be framed as desperation. Any silence as guilt. Creators speculated carefully, often asking leading questions that implied answers. This preserved deniability while guiding audience conclusions. Viewers felt clever for connecting dots that may not exist. The alleged X resurfaced symbolically again, not as a person, but as a reminder that the past can return at any moment. This threat narrative kept audiences engaged without new information. As days passed, fatigue appeared, but belief remained. The story stopped trending loudly, but it did not dissolve. It settled into assumption. This phase demonstrated how quickly leveraged narratives override logic. Once audiences believe someone holds power, they stop demanding proof. Power itself becomes proof. The internet prepared for escalation that might never arrive. Viewers waited for confirmation that was already emotionally accepted. The absence of release did not weaken the narrative. It strengthened it. By the end of this phase, the story had fully transformed. It was no longer about a tape, a claim, or even specific behavior. It was about dominance, fear, and control. That transformation made correction nearly impossible. How do you disprove something that was never shown? How do you challenge a claim built on absence? The narrative moved forward quietly, shaping perception without requiring attention. It lived in comment sections, side remarks, and casual references. The stage was now set for the next phase, where pressure increases, our expectations harden, and every move is interpreted as confirmation of a story already believed. By the time the narrative reached this stage, silence was no longer neutral. It had been rebranded as evidence. The internet, conditioned by repetition and expectation, began treating the absence of response from Erika Kirk as confirmation of everything it already believed. This shift marked a critical turning point, where speculation no longer needed momentum. It had become self-sustaining. The framing around Candace Owens evolved again. She was no longer portrayed as someone threatening exposure. She was framed as someone who did not need to. According to the dominant narrative, the mere possibility of leverage was enough to control outcomes. This logic resonated widely because it fit a familiar power story. The influence plus secrecy equals dominance. Online commentary leaned heavily into this interpretation. Posts suggested that restraint itself was strategy. The idea spread that if nothing were true, there would be nothing to fear. This reasoning ignored nuance entirely, but nuance had already been priced out of the conversation. Hashtags shifted accordingly. Tags implying fear, control, and quiet compliance replaced earlier language of curiosity. These tags instructed viewers to read silence as submission. Once instructed, audiences complied without realizing they were being guided. Tagging behavior intensified once more. Mentions of @Erika Kirk appeared under posts asserting conclusions rather than asking questions. The act of tagging functioned as reinforcement. It reminded audiences of the narrative even when no new information existed. The algorithm rewarded this confidence. Content stating that the situation was obvious traveled further than content expressing uncertainty. Certainty performed better than doubt. Performance dictated visibility. As a result, skeptical perspectives became harder to find. Viewers were repeatedly exposed to the same interpretation until it felt inevitable. Repetition created familiarity. Familiarity created belief. The alleged tape itself faded almost completely from discussion. Its content was irrelevant. Its existence was assumed. Assumption is more efficient than evidence. Evidence requires evaluation. Assumption requires agreement. The cheating narrative hardened further during this phase. It was no longer framed as a question. It was framed as context. Context shapes interpretation invisibly. Once something becomes context, it is rarely challenged. Fan communities reflected this shift. Discussions moved from debate to commentary. Members spoke as if the story were already settled. New participants entered conversations where the conclusion was treated as common knowledge. Language escalated subtly, but decisively. Words like trapped, controlled, and cornered appeared more frequently. These words suggested inevitability. Inevitability discourages inquiry. silence continued to be interpreted through belief. Those aligned with the narrative viewed silence as confirmation. Those skeptical viewed it as damage control. Both interpretations assumed guilt. Innocence was no longer considered. Archived appearances were re-examined again. Neutral expressions were read as tension. Ordinary pauses were framed as anxiety. The past was reinterpreted to support the present belief. The algorithm reinforced this reinterpretation by resurfacing related clips and posts. Viewers encountered fragments without context. Context was unnecessary. Recognition was enough. At this stage, the story no longer depended on Candace Owens at all. It had outgrown its origin. Audiences carried it forward independently, adding speculation without prompting. Creators adapted by framing updates around expectation rather than information. Videos and posts discussed what silence meant instead of what was known. This approach kept engagement high while avoiding new claims. The power narrative proved especially resilient because it could not be disproven. If nothing happened, it was because leverage worked. If something happened, it was because pressure failed. Either outcome confirmed the story. This circular logic locked belief in place. Once locked, belief resisted challenge. Challenge felt unnecessary. The story felt complete. As days passed, active discussions slowed, but conviction remained. The narrative shifted into background awareness. Background awareness shapes interpretation quietly and continuously. Mentions of Erika Kirk still appeared, often casually, often without explanation. These mentions functioned as reminders. They kept association alive even as attention moved elsewhere. The absence of escalation did not weaken belief. It strengthened it. Calm was interpreted as compliance. Stillness was read as surrender. This phase demonstrated how silence can be weaponized by narrative framing. Silence has no meaning until meaning is assigned. Once assigned, it becomes difficult to reclaim. The internet had now accepted a version of events without evidence. Acceptance did not feel reckless. It felt logical because it had been repeated until it felt natural. The story's endurance revealed a deeper truth about online culture. People do not need facts to believe. They need alignment between emotion, authority, and repetition. Those elements were now fully aligned. By the end of this phase, the narrative had settled into assumed reality. Not because anything new happened, but because nothing did. Absence became affirmation. The stage was now set for normalization. When belief stops needing reinforcement, it becomes permanent. The next phase would reveal how this assumed truth embeds itself into long-term perception, shaping future interpretation long after the story stops feeling urgent. By the time the story entered this phase, something irreversible had happened. The narrative no longer required attention to survive. It no longer needed new posts, new speculation, or new escalation. It had crossed into normalization. What once felt shocking now felt familiar, and familiarity quietly transformed assumption into accepted truth. Engagement patterns made this shift clear. Posts about the situation no longer dominated timelines, but they still appeared regularly enough to maintain recognition. Comments became shorter. Reactions replaced debate. The story stopped demanding explanation and started functioning as context. This is the most powerful stage of any viral narrative. At this point, most viewers were no longer asking whether the claims were real. They were referencing them as if they had already been resolved. Nor the absence of confirmation no longer mattered. Repetition had done its work. When something feels widely known, it stops feeling questionable. Hashtags reflected this evolution. Tags that once carried urgency were now used casually, without explanation. They acted as shorthand for an entire storyline. Seeing them triggered recognition rather than curiosity. Recognition feels like understanding, even when details are missing. Tagging behavior followed the same pattern. Mentions of Erika Kirk appeared under unrelated posts. not to demand answers, but to reference the narrative. The act of tagging preserved association without reopening discussion. Over time, repeated association becomes expectation. That expectation quietly reshaped interpretation. Any future appearance by Erika Kirk was filtered through the normalized belief, or neutral actions felt strategic. Ordinary silence felt deliberate. The past informed the present invisibly. The lack of follow-up played a decisive role in this transformation. No widely shared clarification emerged to replace speculation. Without a corrective narrative, the last emotional impression remained dominant. Silence did not weaken belief. It stabilized it. Platforms unintentionally reinforced this persistence. Old posts remained searchable. Clips resurfaced without timestamps. Algorithms preserved fragments without context, allowing the story to reappear stripped of nuance. Viewers encountered pieces, not processes. This created a distorted archive. New audiences encountered references without origin. They inherited assumptions rather than evidence. Over time, inherited belief felt natural and unquestioned. Fan communities adjusted accordingly. Discussions shifted from analysis to reference. Members mentioned the situation as background knowledge rather than something to examine. Questioning it felt unnecessary, even disruptive. This normalization discouraged skepticism. Challenging the narrative required effort, context, and risk of social pushback. Accepting it required none of those things. Convenience favored belief. The power narrative surrounding Candace Owens also normalized. She was no longer framed as threatening exposure. She was framed as someone whose influence was already understood. Influence itself became the story. This framing reduced the need for action. If leverage already worked, nothing further needed to happen. The lack of escalation became evidence of success. This logic reinforced belief without requiring proof. As time passed, emotional intensity faded, but confidence hardened. Viewers no longer felt shocked. They felt certain. Certainty is quieter than outrage, but far more durable. The story began appearing in broader conversations about influence, loyalty, and image management. It was used as an example rather than examined as a claim. The reference functioned without accuracy because it relied on recognition. Each casual mention reinforced belief. Each belief reduced curiosity. The narrative no longer invited examination. It informed opinions silently. This stage demonstrates why normalization is more dangerous than outrage. Outrage burns quickly. Normalization settles. It shapes perception without drawing attention to itself. The lack of resolution discouraged empathy. Without clarity, audiences defaulted to their initial interpretations. There was no incentive to revisit judgments. The story had already served its purpose as content. The internet often celebrates exposure as accountability. This phase revealed the flaw in that logic. Exposure without resolution creates lasting ambiguity. Ambiguity normalized becomes assumption embedded. As normalization set in, the controversy lost its ability to generate new insight. It could only reinforce existing impressions. The opportunity for meaningful discussion had passed. The narrative did not end. It settled. And settled narratives are harder to challenge than active ones because they feel obvious. Obviousness discourages inquiry. By now, the story existed as context rather than conversation. Context shapes interpretation invisibly. It does not announce itself. This persistence affected future moments. The audiences became quicker to judge, slower to question, and more comfortable with assumption. The lesson was learned implicitly. The internet moved forward, carrying this normalized belief into new stories. When future narratives involved power, silence, or influence, reaction would be faster and patience shorter. The cycle accelerated. This phase is often overlooked because it lacks drama. Yet, it is where reputational impact settles. Loud reaction fades. Quiet belief remains. The story no longer needed to trend to matter. It influenced perceptions silently. That influence would persist until challenged, and challenge rarely arrives after attention fades. By the end of this phase, belief was no longer loud, it was embedded. And embedded belief does not require reinforcement, it waits. While the next phase confronts what happens after belief embeds fully, when stories stop being discussed entirely, but continue shaping perception long after everyone believes they've moved on. By this stage, the narrative no longer felt like a story unfolding in real time. It felt like something that had already happened. That shift mattered more than any reveal ever could. Once belief becomes normalized, it stops announcing itself. It operates quietly, shaping interpretation without asking for attention or permission. The conversation around Erika Kirk had largely moved on, but the assumption had not. It lingered in comment sections, in casual references, and in the way new content was received. Viewers no longer needed reminders. The narrative lived in the background, influencing perception automatically. This is how invisible power works online. At this point, most mentions of the situation were indirect. People referenced it without explanation, assuming shared understanding. That assumption was powerful because it discouraged questions. When something is treated as common knowledge, asking for proof feels unnecessary, even disruptive. Hashtags reflected this invisibility. They appeared less frequently, but when they did, they functioned as shorthand. A single tag could summon the entire narrative without restating it. Recognition replaced discussion. Recognition feels like certainty. Tagging behavior followed the same pattern. Mentions of @Erika Kirk surfaced occasionally under unrelated posts, not to provoke reaction, but to anchor association. The tag acted like a quiet reminder, reinforcing the narrative without reopening it. Neither this quiet reinforcement reshaped interpretation over time. Any new appearance, interview, or silence involving Erika Kirk was filtered through the embedded belief. Neutral actions felt strategic. Ordinary pauses felt calculated. The narrative no longer needed to be stated to be applied. The lack of resolution continued to play a central role. No widely shared clarification emerged to challenge the assumption. Without a competing narrative, the last dominant impression remained unopposed. Silence did not erase belief. It preserved it. Platforms unintentionally strengthened this effect. Old posts remained searchable. Clips resurfaced through recommendations. Algorithms resurfaced fragments without context, allowing the story to reappear without explanation. Context was optional. Recognition was enough. This created a layered archive where fragments outlived their origins. New audiences encountered references without knowing the beginning. They inherited conclusions rather than evidence. Over time, inherited belief felt natural. Fan communities adjusted fully to this reality. Discussions no longer examined the situation, they referenced it. The difference is critical. Examination invites correction. Reference assumes closure. This normalization discouraged empathy. Once belief embeds, revisiting it requires effort and humility. The internet rewards neither. Accepting assumption is easier than questioning it. The power narrative surrounding Candace Owens also became normalized. She was no longer framed as actively exerting pressure. Her influence was treated as understood. Influence no longer needed to act to be effective. This framing reduced the need for escalation. If leverage already worked, nothing further had to happen. Calm became confirmation. Stillness became success. As emotional intensity faded, confidence hardened. Viewers no longer felt shocked or angry. They felt sure. Certainty is quieter than outrage, but it lasts longer. The story began influencing broader conversations about influence, loyalty, and image management. It was used as an example rather than examined as a claim. The example functioned without accuracy because it relied on familiarity. Each casual reference reinforced belief. Each belief reduced curiosity. The narrative no longer invited examination. It informed opinions silently. This phase revealed why normalization is more impactful than virality. Virality draws attention. Normalization shapes culture. Culture influences perception long after attention moves on. The lack of resolution also lowered standards for future stories. Viewers learned that assumptions can settle without proof. This lesson carried forward into how new narratives were received. The internet often celebrates exposure as accountability. This phase exposed the flaw in that logic. Exposure without follow-up creates ambiguity. Ambiguity normalized becomes embedded suspicion. As normalization deepened, the controversy lost its ability to generate new insight. It could only reinforce existing impressions. The opportunity for meaningful discussion had passed. The narrative did not end. It embedded. Embedded narratives are the hardest to challenge because they feel obvious. Obviousness discourages inquiry. By now, the story existed as background context. Our context shapes interpretation invisibly. It does not announce itself. It simply frames what feels plausible. This persistence affected future moments. Audiences became quicker to judge, slower to question, and more comfortable with assumption. The lesson was absorbed quietly. The internet moved forward, carrying this embedded belief into new stories. When future narratives involved power, silence, or influence, reaction would be faster and patience shorter. The cycle accelerated. This phase rarely feels dramatic, but it is where reputational impact settles. Loud reaction fades. Quiet belief remains. The story no longer needed to trend to matter. It influenced perceptions silently. That influence would persist until challenged, and challenge rarely arrives after belief embeds. What remained was not a tape, not a claim, not a confrontation. What remained was a frame through which future information would be viewed. And once a frame is installed, everything that follows is seen through it, whether anyone remembers why or not. When the narrative finally disappeared from trending pages, many assumed it was over. In reality, this was the moment it reached its most permanent form. Without debate, without updates, and without resolution, the story surrounding Erika Kirk transitioned from conversation into quiet belief. What no longer needed attention gained endurance. At this stage, most people could not recall where the claims began. They remembered no original post, no first clip, no defining moment. What they remembered was the conclusion they had absorbed along the way. Memory preserved emotion, not evidence. And emotion shaped perception far more effectively than facts ever could. This phase revealed a fundamental truth about online culture. The internet does not archive truth. It archives reaction. What survives is not what was proven, but what felt convincing at the loudest moment. That feeling becomes the lasting record. Mentions of the story still appeared occasionally, detached from explanation. A comment referencing that situation, a hashtag used without context, a subtle tag under an unrelated post. These fragments functioned as shorthand, summoning the entire narrative without restating it. Tagging behavior reinforced this quiet persistence. Mentions of Erika Kirk surfaced sporadically, not to provoke discussion, but to preserve association. Each tag acted as a reminder that the narrative still existed, even if no one was actively talking about it. That association quietly shaped interpretation going forward. Any new appearance, interview, or silence involving Erika Kirk was filtered through the embedded belief. Neutral actions felt intentional. Ordinary pauses felt strategic. The past influenced the present invisibly. Platforms played a silent role in maintaining this state. Old posts remained searchable. Clips resurfaced through recommendations without timestamps or explanation. Algorithms resurfaced fragments without outcomes. The system remembered what trended, not what was resolved. Creators who once amplified the story rarely revisited it. There was little incentive to return once engagement faded. Corrections did not perform well. Reflection did not monetize. Moving on was rewarded. Looking back was not. This created a responsibility gap. Exposure happened loudly. Follow-up happened rarely. The loud phase shaped memory. The quiet phase determined long-term impact. Audiences internalized this pattern. They learned to react quickly and forget origins slowly. They carried impressions forward without revisiting sources. Over time, this habit lowered the standard for belief across digital spaces. The Erika Kirk narrative illustrated this cycle clearly. A suggestion of leverage appeared. Speculation escalated. Silence was interpreted. Assumption hardened. Attention faded. Belief remained. The process did not require confirmation to succeed. This outcome reshaped expectations around authenticity. Viewers became comfortable assuming that public images are curated by default. The idea that silence implies strategy felt intuitive. Skepticism towards sincerity increased even outside this story. The long-term effect was subtle but significant. Each unresolved narrative added weight to future assumptions. Patience declined. Nuance became harder to sustain. Simple explanations felt safer than complex realities. The internet often frames exposure as accountability. This final stage revealed the flaw in that framing. Exposure without resolution produced lasting ambiguity. Ambiguity, normalized, became embedded suspicion. Responsibility at this stage was diffuse. Platforms could contextualize, resurfacing content. Creators could revisit narratives after the noise settled. Audiences could reward depth over drama. None of these actions were structurally encouraged. The system preferred movement to reflection. It moved forward carrying unresolved impressions as baggage. That baggage accumulated quietly, shaping culture without scrutiny. This story did not end with confirmation or denial. It ended with residue. Residue influenced perception more quietly than outrage ever could. The most uncomfortable truth was this: once belief settled, undoing it was difficult. Correcting belief required more effort than forming it. The internet rarely invested that effort after attention shifted. Understanding this cycle mattered. Without understanding, the pattern repeated endlessly. A hint of leverage surfaced. Reaction exploded. Speculation escalated. Fatigue followed. Normalization set in. Belief persisted. The narrative surrounding Erika Kirk no longer needed to be discussed to matter. It existed as background context, influencing perception invisibly. That was its final form. What remained was not the alleged tape, not the speculation, and not the supposed confrontation. What remained was the frame through which future information would be viewed. And once a frame is installed, everything that follows is interpreted through it, whether anyone remembers why or not. If you stayed until the end, pause before letting this story become another quiet assumption. Viral power plays thrive on speed, but understanding demands patience. Before you share, ask what's shown, what's implied, and what's simply repeated. If this breakdown helped you think more clearly, hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who values context over clicks. Drop your take in the comments, but keep it grounded, not reaction first. Use hashtags with care, not impulse. Hashtag think before you share, hashtag context over clicks, hashtag digital literacy, hashtag storytelling. And tag at Erika Kirk to invite respectful discussion, never harassment. Follow for long-form commentary that slows the feed down and revisits stories after the noise fades. Remember, real accountability isn't built on rumors or leveraged narratives. It's built on evidence, empathy, and the courage to question momentum when everyone else rushes ahead. Choose curiosity over certainty, nuance over outrage, and patience over panic. Every time you scroll, online responsibility starts with you today.